I'm pleased now to introduce the second keynote speaker, Sabina Mihelj. She's a professor of media and cultural analysis at Loughborough University in the UK. She joined the university in 2004 after working and studying in Slovenia, Hungary, and Germany. Her main areas of expertise include mass communication and cultural identity, comparative media research, television studies, Eastern and Central European media, and the cultural Cold War. Taking a comparative, critical, and historically sensitive approach, Sabina Mihelj wrote extensively on the relationship between mass communication and cultural identity, with a particular focus on issues of national belonging, cosmopolitanism, religion, and cultural memory, across both traditional and new media. Besides numerous journal articles and book chapters, she wrote Media Nations, Communicating Belonging and Exclusion in the Modern World, and Central and Eastern European Media in Comparative Perspective, Politics, Economy, Culture, together with John Downey. Her most recent project offers the first systematic transnational study of media under communist rule and develops a novel framework for comparative media research, which shifts the focus from comparing media systems to comparing media cultures. She sits on the editorial boards of several international media and cultural analysis journals and regularly participates in international research networks and projects. She has received research funding from a range of bodies in the UK and beyond. Today she will present Beyond Cold War Thinking, the Past, Present and Future of European Communication, addressing the advancement of research on media and communication in communist and post-communist Europe, its similarities with media trajectories in liberal democracies, long-standing imbalance in European communication research, and ways of making the field more genuinely pan-European. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to present Sabina Mihelj.
Thank you, Alenka. When I accepted the invitation to do this keynote back in January, I had in mind a rather different talk than the one I'm about to deliver. This Ecrea conference, I thought, was a moment to look at the achievements of European communication research and note just how far we have come in making our field more inclusive and more truly pan-European. To start with, this is the first Ecrea conference in a post-communist country since the establishment of the association. Secondly, over the past 25 years, the quantity, quality, and visibility of East European research increased significantly. It's now far more common to find research projects and publications that include cases from Eastern Europe or are written by scholars from the region. And in fact, media and communication departments themselves have become more diverse and pan-European in their composition. My own department at Loughborough is a very good demonstration of that. When I joined back in 2004, I was just about the only non-UK member of the full-time academic staff. Today, there are 14 of us. And thirdly, we now have a better understanding of how the Cold War context affected media and communication, both in Western and in Eastern Europe. The simplistic frameworks of interpretation that dominated the debate during the Cold War are being challenged and have been, at least to an extent, surpassed. Now, of course, there are still things that we need to work on, but on the whole, the message that I intended to give today was to be an optimistic one. Well, little did I know back in January that by the time I came to deliver this talk, the ground will have shifted under my feet, and that I'd be living in a country that no longer wants to be a part of Europe, and that at the same time, the US would be led by a democratically elected, yet ultimately undemocratic, racist, and sexist president. Among other things, the result of the referendum in the UK brought home to me just how much the Europe I grew up with differed from the one experienced, debated, and mediated among the majority of citizens of my adoptive country, the United Kingdom. As a Yugoslav and then Slovenian citizen, I spent my formative years in a country where Europe featured, above all, as an ideal to aspire to, a symbol of democracy, of good life for all, and of unity in diversity. As a British resident, I became acquainted with an image of Europe that was very different and often signified the exact opposite: unaccountable elites, inequality, and diversity as a threat. Of course, I shouldn't be exaggerating this contrast. There are many shades of gray I do not have scope to discuss here. Still, I believe that we do need to acknowledge how strikingly different the notions of Europe we live with are, both within and across our different countries. We may be using the same symbols, we may be waving the same flags, but we're not speaking the same language. In light of the result of the British referendum and of the US elections, I found it difficult to retain the optimistic tone I initially had in mind for today's lecture. Yes, European communication research has become in many ways more diverse and inclusive, but it is also beset by new problems and divisions. What will the future of European communication be post-Brexit or even post-US election? Will media scholars working in Britain be able to sustain their ties with European peers? And perhaps most importantly, how can we make sense of current developments in Europe and beyond, and the role of the media in them? Now, in this context, one may well be tempted to think that the importance of studying Eastern European media pales in significance compared to the study of the current crisis. But what I want to argue today is the exact opposite, namely that recent developments actually call for more rather than less engagement with Eastern Europe. To put it differently, Eastern European media should not be treated as an irrelevant periphery, but as a key research laboratory that can help us understand some of the key trends in European communication as a whole. In the time I have at my disposal, I will seek to demonstrate this by discussing two issues. One is the involvement of the media in the reproduction of nationalism, and the other is the history of Cold War media. First, nationalism. Nationalism has been a mainstay of my research ever since the beginning of my career. In my PhD, which I completed in Slovenia, I examined the changing media discourses of nationhood in the former Yugoslavia and its successor states, looking at cases involving the coverage of migration, Europe, and the Yugoslav wars. My interest in media nationalism continued beyond my PhD. My most recent foray into this area was actually a little project that I developed with Enrique Castello to do with consumer nationalism. But to my surprise, I soon realized upon moving to the UK that my interest was shared by rather few British researchers. And even among those who did share it, the vast majority were immigrants themselves. And in fact, immigrants from European peripheries, just like me. Or, alternatively, there were scholars who studied countries and regions beyond Western Europe or beyond Northern America. To put it differently, in the UK and in the English-speaking world, academia more generally, nationalism felt decidedly passé. A quick look at the English language books focusing on media and nationalism serves to demonstrate these trends. These are just books published over the past decade or so. Among general books on the topic, you'd be hard-pressed to find one that is written by an author who doesn't originate from or is based in one of the European peripheries. From Mirka Medianu's Mediating the Nation, to Katja Valeskivi's Cool Nations, and my own Media Nations, to volumes such as Media, Nationalism, and European Identities, edited by Miklos Sukoš and the late Karl Jakubovic, the pattern is remarkably clear. Likewise, looking at books examining a particular region or country, you'd get the impression that mediated nationalism is in fact a matter of former colonies, such as Egypt or Malaysia, marginalized minorities, such as the indigenous populations in Canada and Australia, or undemocratic countries such as China. And when you finally do come across a book looking at a Western European country and its nationalism in the media, it happens to be, surprise, surprise, Germany. You might object by thinking I have forgotten a key book-length study of nationalism in Western Europe, which, although not focused only on the media, frequently features among references in our field, namely Michael Billig's Banal Nationalism. But of course I didn't forget. After all, Billig's office used to be located just a few doors down from mine at Loughborough. But his study was published over 20 years ago, and the main message that his readers seems to have taken from it was that in countries such as the UK or the US, nationalism persists in a form that is so banal and so innocuous in a way that it is hardly worth discussing. I'm not suggesting that this is what Billig intended, quite to the contrary. But as is often the case, popular concepts and theories tend to have a life on their own. The UK referendum, however, made it blatantly obvious that mediated nationalism is not just a problem of the peripheries, and that its incarnations in Western Europe and Northern America are not limited only to banal nationalism. Nationalist discourse was critical to the success of the UK referendum. And as usual, this discourse served to provide a convenient but ultimately misleading explanation of the various grievances held by Brexit voters, hiding the complex causes of inequalities and offering false promises of their resolution. But spotting nationalism in the Brexit campaign is easy. In fact, it's too easy, I think. Characters such as Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, or the infamous Breaking Point poster, make for two obvious targets of criticism and ridicule. What the Eastern European experience with nationalism teaches us, if only we look at it more closely, is that nationalism isn't limited only to the far right, nor associated only with anti-European sentiments, but is inescapable across the political spectrum, including in pro-EU and pro-democratic messages. In post-communist Eastern Europe, pressures for reform and democratization and support for European integration were frequently fueled by a nationalist impulse to distance oneself from the supposedly less democratic, less civilized, and somehow less European neighbors further to the east or the south. Who those wretched nations unworthy of joining Europe and incapable of democracy were was a matter of perspective. For the Baltic nations, it was the Russians. For Slovenians, it was the Croatians. For Croatians, it was the Serbs. For Serbs, it was Romanians and Bulgarians, and so on and so on. In the Brexit campaign, the ideological fault lines were somehow different, of course, but here too nationalist discourse was peddled by both sides of the debate and across the media landscape. For Remainers, the key benefits of the EU were economic benefits for the nation. For Leavers, the solution lied in increased national autonomy and control over immigration. Both forms of nationalism evaluated EU membership from a national British perspective, not from the perspective of the broader community of Europeans, let alone from the perspective of a shared humanity. For your family, for your children, for your pension, for your pay packet, for your jobs, and the National Health Service, don't take a leap into the dark. Vote Remain today. This is how one of the pro-Remain papers in the UK urged, clearly addressing an audience of British nationals, not an audience of Europeans. So it was not that nationalist discourse won over Europeanism, rather one form of nationalism and the accompanying form of Europeanism won over the other. The Europe of ethnically pure, culturally homogeneous and independent nations won over the Europe of economic benefits and losses. Unless we understand this multiformity of nationalism and the inherent compatibility and interdependence of national and transnational belonging, as well as the involvement of media in both, we'll keep missing the point. To put it differently, nationalism was and is also our problem. The problem of the 48% of British voters who voted to remain in the EU, the problem of all those of us who feel European or cosmopolitan, and perhaps even emphasize this belonging above and beyond any national affiliation. There is a simple reason for that. We still live in a world of nation states, and with that, in a world of media nations. Yes, our media nations have become increasingly interconnected and globalized, but they have remained nations nonetheless. And as such, they create bonds of inclusion and understanding, but they also keep erecting boundaries that exclude and create misunderstanding. The second topic I want to reflect on briefly today has to do with the history of Eastern European media during the Cold War. Most of the examples I'll be using relate to television, a medium that was also at the center of a research project that I'm currently completing called Screening Socialism, funded by the Leverhulme Trust. In the course of the project, we produced a short video which sums up what the project is about and also includes some archival footage from the region. So instead of me talking, let's have a look.
The sound of white noise and the grain image you have just seen are by now a part of history. Since the times when people used to watch television using receivers such as this one, television has changed in rather dramatic ways. The screens have grown bigger and bigger, the quality of the broadcast image has improved, and the range of programs and channels available has risen exponentially. The way we watch television changed as well. In fact, many of us hardly watch television as such at all. Instead, we might download a few of our favorite programs onto a laptop or onto a tablet, or even watch them over a mobile phone. In short, compared to the world of digital television we live with today, the world of old-style analog television may seem rather strange. And yet it's precisely this strange world of pre-digital television that we wanted to examine in our research project. To do so, however, we decided to move beyond the familiar terrain of Western Europe and Northern America and focus instead on experiences in communist Eastern Europe. More precisely, we studied television histories across 5 different communist countries: the Soviet Union, Poland, East Germany, Romania, and Yugoslavia. Over the course of 3 years of our project, we studied thousands and thousands of old television schedules. We also watched, as you might imagine, hundreds and hundreds of old television programs. And then we pored over tons of archival materials, as well as interviewed over 170 different viewers from a range of 8 different countries.
So why do we choose to focus on communist television? After all, we have this picture of communist television as an instrument of propaganda, filled with boring political speeches and educational programming. But actually, over the course of our research, we found that there's a lot more to communist television than just propaganda and boredom. Now, of course, political control was a part of everyday life for television professionals. But over time, those professionals became a lot more adept at producing programming that was not only ideologically correct, but also wildly popular with audiences. Our interviewees recalled the children's programs they grew up with and watching series with their families. And they spoke, often with great affection, of their favourite television personalities and actors. So in many ways we could say that socialist television is very similar to television anywhere else in the world. It's an important part of everyday life, as well as a source of information, education, but above all, entertainment. But of course, over the course of our research, we've also found that there are important differences between communist television and television that we're familiar with in the West. Television served to remind viewers that they were taking part in an enormous revolutionary experiment, one that was building a more equal society, and a society that was abolishing grand inequalities of wealth. And we could also say that communist television served to mask the gap between the ideological visions and the everyday realities of life under communism.
The challenge of understanding communist television lies precisely in acknowledging both sides of the coin. On the one hand, its role as an instrument of propaganda, and on the other hand, its positive contributions to culture, education, entertainment, and even on occasion to social critique. This also means that the world of television we live with today is not necessarily better than the one we lived with yesterday. Studying television history, therefore, not only teaches us about how much our media world has changed, but also helps us reflect on what we have gained as well as lost in the process.
Pesnici daju folklorni ansambli.
Koliko puta sam udarila po klaviru?
As the video indicates, research on Cold War media requires a constant weighing of similarities and differences at several levels, between state socialist media on the one hand and the media in the liberal democracies of the West on the other hand, as well as among state socialist media themselves. For far too long, such comparisons were guided by simplistic binaries: totalitarianism versus democracy, freedom versus oppression, the public sphere versus propaganda. But such binary contrasts offer a rather impoverished account of Cold War communication for two reasons. First, these models are at best suitable when looking at the initial period of communist rule and when examining political ideals and rhetoric rather than actual practices and programs. As soon as we move beyond that, the binary models fall apart. And second, these concepts account only for only the most obviously political aspects of communication, if even that, such as new genres, for instance. But they tell us little about entertainment, educational, or fictional content, let alone about audiences and their ways of engaging with such content. Their focus, then, is primarily on media systems, rather than on the patterns of meanings and practices that make up media cultures. Once we take a more holistic view, a much more varied picture emerges, one that cannot be fitted into established East-West dichotomies. Let me mention just three examples. First, state socialist media were guided by a strong sense of public mission, akin to the one familiar from traditions of public broadcasting in Western Europe. Broadcasting was seen as a powerful means of information, universal education, and cultural refinement, as well as entertainment, and as an institution that would enable socialist citizens from all walks of life to partake in the best the country had to offer. This understanding of state socialist broadcasting evolved in opposition to the image of capitalist media as subjected to the private interests of the wealthy few, and designed to reproduce existing relationships of power and exploitation. In a similar vein, public broadcasting in Western Europe, as we know, came to be seen as an alternative to commercial broadcasting, as a public good that had to be shielded from commercial pressure. Both state socialist television and the Western Public Broadcasting Service thus operated in somewhat similar discursive and normative universes, in which public goods were pitched against private interests and in which the market was seen as a source of distortions that needed to be kept at bay. Of course, practice often belied these noble intentions. I'm not naive about that. But it would be wrong to dismiss this sense of public mission as only rhetoric. For instance, let us look at this chart, which shows the genre structures of television programming in different countries round about the early 1970s. As shown here, the key contrast lies not between state socialist and Western broadcasters, but between commercial broadcasters on the one hand and public and state socialist broadcasters on the other. In programming offered by both public and state socialist broadcasters, the proportions of information, education, and culture are considerably larger than in programming offered by commercial broadcasters. These similarities bring me to my second point. In some respects, British and French television, for instance, had more in common with, say, Polish or Yugoslav television at the time than they did with US television. The public mission is one area where this becomes evident. Another is the origin of program imports. Most countries in both Western and Eastern Europe shared a similar love-hate relationship with American culture and media. Audiences loved it, elites derided it, privileging instead the import of TV programs from other European countries. BBC's Forsyte Saga, for instance, is one such example of a program that was broadcast on both sides of the Iron Curtain. And to add yet another example, broadcast professionals from both sides of the continent often collaborated and exchanged know-how. All of this, we could argue, was giving rise to a pan-European audiovisual culture well before the end of the Cold War and well before EU enlargement was even remotely in sight. Of course, differences between East and West existed too, but not only in the usual places. The gendered nature of television cultures East and West offers a good example. Because of the much higher rates of women's employment in communist countries, including employment in the media, women spent considerably less time watching television, and daytime television was rather different from patterns familiar in the West at the time. Programming aimed at women was less common, and when it did appear, it served to remind women that they are meant to perform a dual role, carrying the double burden of both waged work outside of the home and domestic duties. This characteristic communist superwoman was prominent also in fiction and in entertainment programming, and I would say to some extent in real life as well, believe it or not. Now, you might be thinking, this is all very well and interesting, but why does it matter? First, it matters because it prevents us from shutting out communist media as something radically different from our media, as something backward and not quite modern, and therefore something that doesn't bear much relevance for the study of European media today. Our field is notoriously obsessed with the present, always on the lookout for the latest development in communication. But it is also, I would argue, still clinging to a rather narrow understanding of the present, one that tacitly assumes that modern mass communication everywhere will ultimately converge towards the same model of development, a model combining some form of democracy with capitalist economy. Given this state of our field, it's not a surprise that most of the recent groundbreaking research on state socialist media was initially conducted by historians and area specialists rather than by media scholars. Paulina Bren, Christine Evans, Christine Rothai, Heather Gumbert are only some of the names that come to mind. It is only recently that our own field started catching up, thanks to authors such as Aniko Imre, Lance Lundgren, Dana Mustata, Irena Raifova, and others. Like the Screening Socialism project, this recent research emphasizes the shared and tangled histories of the media on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Despite stemming from different ideological roots, the rival visions of modern society that underpinned the different media developments, East and West, all shared a belief in progress, in the pursuit of good life for all, as well as a propensity for utopian visions of the future, be it a classless society or a global democracy. And they were also involved in finding solutions to the same fundamental problems of modern social organization, which continue to preoccupy us today. How to balance individual and collective rights? To what extent should social development be managed by the state or left to the market? And so on. But the experience of state socialist television is not only of historical relevance. A decade ago, it may still have been possible to think that the liberal media world was here to stay, and that its historical competitors, state socialist media included, had been consigned to the dustbin of history. But as recent developments in Hungary, Russia, China, and also to some extent in the UK and the US remind us, it would be wrong to think that the liberal democratic approach to media governance possesses a universal and lasting appeal. Studying the bygone era of Cold War media is therefore not only of historical interest, but can also elucidate some of the key trends in our field in the present. By comparing the trajectories of change during and after communist rule to patterns of transformation in countries with different political histories and cultural backgrounds, we can gain a better grasp of why our own media today are as they are. And in that way, we will also be better equipped to offer a meaningful critique of present developments, and through that, do what we can to help preserve the historical achievements of democratic communication for our future. Let me conclude with a thanks and an apology. The apology goes to you all. Sadly, I won't be able to stay in Prague for much longer. I have a little baby at home who's barely 2 months old, and 24 hours is about as much she can stay without me at the moment. Finally, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference, Irena Raifova and her team, not only for inviting me to deliver this keynote, but also for being so patient and accommodating. I was able to actually confirm my attendance only a couple of weeks ago, which I'm sure made for quite a few gray hairs. So again, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Okay, we are now opening floor for questions and comments.
Józef Niżnik. I believe this very interesting paper is very good inspiration for quite essential question that I believe we should formulate at this conference. The one is related to even our name, European Communication Association. I just miss the rest. What does it mean, European? In what sense we are European? As I have a feeling that we never ask ourselves. I get back to this in a second. And the next issue, which also seems very important, is for what we are responsible for. Are we responsible only for our careers, for books that, as we could see even in the corridor, in the lobby here, are numerous, and of course there are many more elsewhere on communication? Or are we responsible also for communication in Europe, between Europeans? Please have a look into the program. We have an enormous amount of papers, very interesting, intriguing in some cases, but I couldn't find papers that would deal with the problems of communication between Europeans, I mean transnational communication. We claim the deficit of democracy in European Union. In fact, this is not a deficit of democracy, but this is a deficit of communication of European Union with citizens. Aren't we responsible for falling apart unity in European Union? Or should we really start to feel this kind of responsibility? So this is, I mean, unfortunately, the present speaker is the first to answer these questions, which are not easy, I understand.
Thank you. Yeah, I do agree that these are some of the fundamental questions that I hope will be raised during the course of this conference. Just some very dispersed thoughts on the topic. What do we mean by Europe? I think certainly in the UK that was part of the problem, at least in the public realm. As you could have gleaned from my presentation, the notions of Europe were very restrictive. Yes, what does it mean, European, which is connected to what we mean by Europe. On one hand, we had an economic definition of Europe, which was more inclusive, but it was reducing politics to economy. And the other one was, of course, perhaps the most obviously nationalist one, and the one we are more keen or we find more easy to distance ourselves from. So how do we make sure, actually, that we move beyond the two? And I'm not suggesting an uncritical idealism. Of course, Europe and European Union in particular is as it is, and there are good reasons for why the meanings of Europe have become so restricted as they have, but still. On the second topic, what are we responsible for? I think it would be, on the one hand, a bit presumptuous of ourselves to think that we will change the world. And there were generations before us that tried to do it and failed miserably. But on the other hand, giving up on contributing something to realities beyond our careers in the academia is something we should attempt to do. The question is just how. As some of you no doubt will know, in the UK we are suddenly all forced to do impact. We are all forced to think beyond our academic cocoons. But again, we are forced by the state. Whether that's a solution, I'm not sure. But it at least offers us a kick to think in that direction. So let's continue thinking, and I hope there will be many productive opportunities for discussion over the course of the coming days for that.